to give a warm landmark and Rapid City welcome to Clare Lopez.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're grateful.
Awesome audience. Wow. It's full. Wow. Thank you all so much for coming out on a weekday night when I expect many of you probably have to get up in the morning and go into work. So we'll try to do this in the Cliff's Notes version, the mini fire hose. But I definitely do want to make sure we leave time for Q&A at the end, because we will do that. And thank you all again for the warm welcome. So even though as I left my hotel room tonight, I was watching our illustrious president take the podium. I mean, I could barely contain my excitement, but I had to go because the car was waiting for me. And he was going to talk about, he began to talk about, you know, the meetings that they held today out in California, right, with our #1 strategic enemy in the world, China, and Xi Jinping and his people that were there. And you saw how Gavin Newsom cleaned up San Francisco? Amazing how that works when you really want to do it, right? But so I did not catch all of the remarks, but I'm sure you'll catch the recap later on tonight or tomorrow, and they'll you know, catch the high points of this meeting. But as best I could tell before I left the room was that climate change is really going good, and she promised to do something about the fentanyl. You know, the precursors that come out of China to the Mexican cartels that kill over 100,000 Americans every single year, and many, if not most of those, are young people. Something about a promise, like, oh, you know, we're not going to do that anymore. We promise. So those are the things that I heard before I left the room, but you'll catch the rest later, I'm sure. But tonight, and even before that, you know, summit meeting and all took place today, I thought to talk to you about what was going on in the Middle East. That is what I thought I'd cover tonight. I'm sure that, you know, you've been watching and you've seen things about it, maybe not knowing exactly what's going on. So I thought I would divide this into 3 parts, right? So we'll start with just like what happened on what we've started to call the Shabbat massacre of October the 7th, where things are now, as best we can tell. And then the second part, where does this Jew hatred come from? Where is this? And I'll tell you, I and others as well, who've been watching these things for a long time, have been really taken aback by not just the ferocity and the venomousness, but the scope, the size of these, you know, Jew hatred protests on the streets, and of course on university campuses all over America and elsewhere in Western Europe, supposedly bastions of, you know, Western liberal style democracy. And then the third part tonight that I want to do is bringing it home. How does this affect us? Why do we care that there's a shofar sitting on the shelf over there? What is this? You know, what does this that's going on over there have to do with us even here in the United States, or specifically South Dakota? So, okay, to begin then, again, what we're calling the Shabbat or the Sabbath massacre of October the 7th is when Hamas jihadis crossed the border into Israel and attacked all around the periphery of the Israeli border with Gaza. Kibbutzim, you know what kibbutzim are, yeah? Right, the kibbutzim are small communities. They're typically small towns, small communities, and they are very often agricultural. They usually are working fields and growing crops. And then other small towns around the periphery. Also, they did attack a few military installations and some police stations too. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they went for the civilians. They specifically went after the civilians. And how many or any of you ever been to Israel? Oh, a whole bunch of you. That's fantastic. I've been there a number of times myself. I've been on that border with Gaza multiple times. I've been in the town of Sderot, which is one of those places that got attacked. And anybody ever been to Sderot, the town on the, you have? Well, you know what I'm talking about, but it's one of the towns. It's more than just a kibbutz. It's quite a town. I don't know how many thousands, but I've been there, and a few years ago was the last time. A couple of things that I recall about this place that just got devastated. I mean, they swept through their atrocities you don't even think about. But in Sderot, they've got a children's playground. Did you ever go there? The children's playground, I mean the slides, the swings, the merry-go-rounds, they're underground. They're literally underground, as the playground itself is a bomb shelter. And then within the playground area is a bomb shelter. So bomb shelter on top of bomb shelter. And there also in Sderot was a police station that's now completely destroyed. But in the back, in the courtyard, they've got these shelves. They had these shelves. And on the shelves, they put the remnants, the remains of shards and of rockets that had been fired over the months, the years at Sderot. And the shelves are just full of pieces of rockets that these guys just fire into Sderot. I mean, for no reason other than they want to kill Jews. That's the only reason. So bringing things up to date so far, they murdered. The number now is a little bit lower than what we feared at the very beginning. And the number I'm hearing now of killed on the 7th, I guess the 8th, a couple of days worth, is about 1,200 Israelis. And injured many, many more than that. And then, of course, hundreds taken hostage. And we don't know exactly how many are hostage, but I'll tell you that there are hostages taken from many different countries, not just Israelis, but including Americans who also were killed on that day. Most of them, very few have been released, but most of them are still hostages. We surmise that many of them are probably down in the tunnels. You probably know that under Gaza, by the way, Gaza is really small. I mean, Israel is small, but Gaza is literally 10 miles wide by about 20 miles long. 10 by 20, that's it. It's quite small. There are a couple of big population centers. One in the north is Gaza City that they're concentrating on now. Further to the south, are others. But it's really not a big place. Overall population before all of this was around 2 million, or maybe a little more than 2 million, something like that. So that is what we're talking about. Do you know who Caroline Glick is? Caroline Glick, a couple, but she is American born and raised in the United States, but then some years ago made Aliyah to Israel. She's married. I think they have at least a couple, maybe 3 children, and they live over in Israel. I think she lives in Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong about that. And she's a very, very astute observer, analyst, writer. She has her own podcast show with a bi-weekly, or 2 or 3 times a week, really, bringing us up to date. You should look her up, Glick, G-L-I-C-K, Caroline Glick. And anyway, what I was going to tell you is that she and others are thinking that in the beginning, we know that Iran, the Iranian regime, coordinated all of this at the very top levels, and I mean from the president, Raisi, the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, to the IRGC, that's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and its unit called the Quds Force, and that they were meeting as often as a couple or more times per week, every week since August of this year, meeting in Beirut, in Lebanon, together with the Secretary General of Hezbollah. By the way, always pronounce it Hezbollah. You know why? Because that gets you the meaning of the word in Arabic. It's Arabic, of course. Hizb means the party or party. And then Allah, of course, is the Arabic word for God. So the party of God. But if you don't say it that way, you lose the meaning. Hizballah. Anyway, they met there, all of these together, including sometimes the foreign minister of Iran, Hossein Amir Abdullahian, went and attended those meetings too. They were coordination meetings. They were preparing this for a long, long time. I'll get to some of the ideas about why Israel missed the signals, the intelligence. I'll get to that. But Caroline, back to Caroline Glick, whom I know, she thinks that those coordination meetings in the beginning were meant to plan a strategic attack from three sides. From the north, out of Lebanon by Hezbollah, from the south by Hamas and PIJ. When I say PIJ, I mean P-I-J, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's the smaller group of jihadis in Gaza that are Shiite and directly formed by Iran, where Hamas is, of course, Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But let me tell you, Caroline, first. And so she thinks that those coordination meetings were to set up a three-way attack, but that Hamas, when they got word about that music festival, you know what I mean, the music festival, those young people right close up on the border with Gaza, that they were just like salivating to get at these young people. And they're from all over the world, not just Israelis, but Americans and many Western Europeans too. But they were doing everything that Islam hates, right? You've got men and women mixing together, horrors. Look at you all next to each other. You've got music, double horrors. You've got, beautiful young girls in summer clothing instead of running around in blue tents. Every one of these things, and probably imbibing some very nice beverages, and they were going all night long, which is why they were still there at 6:30 in the morning on that Saturday, October the 7th. So she thinks, Caroline Glick thinks, that all of those things were just too much of a temptation for Hamas and that they couldn't hold themselves back. And when they found the date and the time of this music festival, they just jumped the gun and went after it. And the plan was that they were supposed to hit and then move from the original attack places, these kibbutzim and so forth, move into the rest of Israel and overtake more of Israel, which was not prepared, and we'll come to that. But they did not move on. They stayed in those original places they invaded and engaged in an orgy, of killing and rape and mutilation and torture. And you know how we know about all of that, right? The videos? They wore GoPro cameras on their jackets and they were uploading the videos as they were committing these atrocities to social media, especially places like Telegram, but other social media too, because they were so happy, so proud of what they were doing. They weren't hiding anything. They were proud of what they were doing. They wanted the world to see, we're Hamas, and this is what we're doing to these hated enemies, babies and children and girls. And they were proud of it. They were boasting to the world. That's why we have the videos. And by the way, I think those videos already have been shown in Israel to audiences of journalists and also to the Knesset, their parliament. And just, the end of last week, I guess, it was shown in the U.S. Congress, which had a mixed audience of journalists and our congressional members. And they showed the videos there. The IDF spliced together kind of a montage of these horrific videos, and they came up with, I don't know what it is, like 20 minutes or something, and showed that video, that montage of horrors, that ought to be absolutely mandatory viewing on every single college campus in America for the entire student body, all of the professors, all of the deans, all of the college presidents, and by the way, the board of whatever they have, directors or advisors or the alumni. But so anyway, Caroline Glick thinks that they jumped the gun, Hamas jumped the gun on the coordinated plan. In a way better, better hardly, but it didn't continue the attack on up into further on up into Israel, right? Part of the reason that let's go to why Israel. Well, wait a minute. First, let me mention this. Instructions now being found in the pockets of dead jihadis. And by the way, we call them jihadis because what they were doing was fighting jihad. Jihad in the books of Islamic law, which I read in English, define what jihad is. Jihad is defined as warfare against the non-Muslim. Okay? I try to get to the gym 3 times a week, okay? But that's not my jihad. That's getting to the gym, on a regular basis. Jihad is warfare against non-Muslims. So in their pockets were found instructions to target civilians in particular. Yes, they attacked some military posts too. Women and girls for rape. This is explicit instructions they're finding in their pockets. Children and babies, which horrific. And to take them hostages. And when people talk about, well, the Gazan people, the civilians, we have to be considerate of them because, they're just civilians. And yeah, okay. Number one, who are Hamas? They are the husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons of the Gazan people. That's who they are. They didn't parachute in from Mars. So there's that. And then there's this. Those communities of these kibbutzim right around Israel, right around Gaza, on that border there, were very good, kind-hearted people. And they were there because they wanted to show their niceness, how hospitable they were, how open they were to working with people from Gaza. And they came in and hired them as gardeners, and they did construction work and put on roofs and things like this. And we know now that those workers, Israel, by the way, not only provided electricity and water to Gaza, but about 20,000 jobs per day that paid 8 to 10 times as much as jobs inside of Gaza would have paid them. And they let them pass through 20,000 or so a day. But we know now that for at least a number of months, if not a couple of years, those workers were coming in to these communities of Jewish kibbutzim and other communities, and they were mapping the layout. They were mapping the homes. They were documenting this home has a father, a mother, 3 children, and they have a dog. And this is the intelligence that they were sending back to Hamas over the last couple of years, maybe, as long as that. And we know this because some of the survivors of the attack recognized some of these people. And they were able to identify them, as well as the fact that they were caught on video on camera, and they could be identified. So, happy, happy, joy, joy, not so much. Okay, so why then was Israel taken by such surprise? The question is still an open one, and there's going to be a real serious after-action investigation, you can be sure. Now is not the time to bash the Israeli government or intelligence services or the military, but very briefly, what probably happened are a couple of things. Number one, because Iran directed all of this, their intelligence service, which is actually a cabinet department in Iran, it's called the Ministry of Intelligence and Security. Want to hear some Farsi? Wizarat Etelat va'amniyat keshvar. That's what that means. Ministry of Intelligence and Security is a cabinet level department. They worked with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with PIJ for, well, a very long time, but on these attacks for at least a number of months ahead of time. And part of what they did, apparently that we understand now, is establish a PSYOP, a psychological operation. And what they did is try to convey the impression that Hamas was not interested in attacking right now. They were happy with the electricity and the water and the jobs and the economic benefits that that brought to the people. And even when Pidge would launch rockets over the border at Israel, for the last couple of years, Hamas did not join in. Okay, they're satisfied. They're okay with their economic, benefits that we're providing. That was the psyop. That was one part of it. Another part of it had to do with kind of a mental concept that the Israelis' very superior technological ability was enough to protect them. For any of you who've been in Israel on the border with Gaza, and I have a number of times, you might remember having seen a wire fence. It's not these big concrete things you see that NPR likes to talk about. It's a wire fencing. It's wire fencing, but they're embedded with these little round black sensors. And those are very sensitive sensors, and they're supposed to catch, anything that's approaching that fence. And then there are watchtowers along the fence line, and they would be alerted, and the border police would respond, and that would, that would deter, deflect any kind of an impending attack. Well, low tech apparently overcame high tech. So there was high tech. So there was a cyber attack. Apparently, more and more now we're hearing that there was a very serious cyber attack that took out a lot of the technological, connectivity and the ability of the Israelis to see an attack coming. So there was that. There was a cyber attack, it appears. But then what did they do? They went along the fence line and they shot, all the guards up in the guard towers. They're gone, they're dead. And then they brought bulldozers to the fence and they just knocked the fence over. And then they attacked by air, by land, and by sea. They came in off the Mediterranean, by the sea. They came over the land. Once the fence was down, you probably saw the pickup trucks and motorcycles and all the rest. And they came by air. If you saw those paragliders, those things are motorized, and the technology comes from, guess, Iran. They made them, or at least the technology to make them comes from Iran. So attacked in 3 ways, and it was, this is basically low tech. Except for the cyber part of it, and that definitely was high tech. So that is part of the reason why they were taken by surprise. The other couple of reasons were these, that you probably know that the high holy days of the Jewish people this year fell in September, and you had Rosh Hashanah, followed by Yom Kippur 10 days later, and then following that was a whole week of Sukkot. Sukkot was a very happy celebration that follows the high holy days. And it's a time when the families get together and they celebrate, and they have meals together, and maybe their attention was not so much on an impending attack, but rather the very last day, that Friday, Saturday, last days of Sukkot. The other reason, Saturday, of course, for the Jewish people is Shabbat, and they were anticipating going to shul and observing Shabbat. And then another reason connected is that there have been a lot of attacks coming out of Judea and Samaria. Don't ever say West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. And there were attacks coming out of the towns like Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarm, accelerating kind of a rate of attacks over these last months, really. And they were sometimes shooting people, sometimes knifing people, sometimes vehicle ramming attacks into Tel Aviv, into Jerusalem. And for that reason, IDF troops that had been down along the border with Gaza, some of them were pulled off and brought up to these towns to go after the jihadis. You might know that this is a clan-based society over there. And each of these towns kind of has its own militia. Like Lion's Den comes out of Jenin, and so forth. And the president of the Palestinian Authority, the PA, goes by the name of Abu Mazen. His name is Mahmoud Abbas. He's in the 19th year of a 4-year term, but that's how these things work. You vote once and that's it. And he's older now and not in the best of health, and he's losing his grip The PA is losing its grip. Hamas is all over Samaria and Judea. And they're stirring up, this kind of terrorist attack. So troops were drawn off. Troops were drawn from the south and taken up to those areas to counter those attacks. So for all of those reasons, and a kind of maybe a little bit of arrogance on the Israeli side in confidence in their own technological superiority, that they probably had the intelligence coming in, but the analysis overrode it because they had the mindset that Hamas is not going to attack right now, doesn't want to attack, and that was the psyop. That's speculative, but in any case. Okay, so let's say, where are we now? Where we are now is that the Israelis very quickly called up well over 300,000 reservists and mustered them around the border with Gaza. They have now entered Gaza, and they're in Gaza City, making, very methodical progress. And we know that in Gaza City are a number of hospitals. I'm sure you've seen all this. A lot of it's propaganda, by the way. And one of the major, biggest hospitals is called the Al-Shifa Hospital. Maybe you've heard of it in the news. And Al-Shifa has been the central headquarters of Hamas, of the leadership. And underneath the hospital are floors and floors and floors. I don't know how many, 4 floors, 5 floors, I'm not even sure how many floors, that are the command and control center for Hamas in Gaza. Yes, they have other centers, but this was their main one. And as you probably know, of course, everything is connected underneath by these tunnels. They call it the Gaza Metro, but it's miles and miles, or kilometers and kilometers of tunnels. And I've been in at least one of those tunnels one time. And by the way, I've also been at the border crossing one of the border crossings between Israel and Gaza. And there's a courtyard there before you go through the gate to cross over. And when we were there, we saw these great big flatbed trucks. And on the flatbed trucks were piled sacks of flour from UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, paid for in part at least by our taxpayer dollars. And so those piles of flour sacks were going across. Other trucks, flatbed, had other sacks, and those sacks were concrete. And, they need to build homes and clinics and kindergartens. But when I went down into one of these tunnels that crossed from Gaza into a kibbutz on the Israeli side, it had been discovered, of course, and most of it blocked up, but enough of it was left open that we could go down into it and see, completely lined in concrete, completely. And there were side branches off of the main tunnel going off in different directions. There were lines for electricity, for ventilation, and there were also little tracks for a little rail car, which wasn't there anymore, but the tracks were still there, and you could see that. So you wonder where our taxpayer dollars are going, and all that cement. Yeah. So, okay, so let's move to the second part that I want to get to tonight. I'm going to watch my watch. And,
Keep going.
Okay. I want to be mindful of you guys' work schedule, that's all. So the second part I wanted to talk about is, where does this venomous hatred come from? As the Israeli, the IDF, are moving through the tunnels, moving through these underground, connections all over, underneath hospitals and clinics. By the way, that's a war crime. Not the Israelis, the jihadis. And under the Geneva Conventions, if a combatant puts military facilities or positions among or underneath, within a civilian structure like a hospital, that's their war crime. And if the IDF strikes against those military installations, and inevitably there are civilian casualties, they're on Hamas. It's their war crime. And of course, you know, the IDF is documenting all of this as they go very carefully. They've got an amazing PR team. I can give you a couple of references if you'd be interested, but one of them that I think is one of the very best is an organization called the Israeli Defense, DSF, Israeli Defense Security Forum, IDSF. And it was founded by a retired IDF general, brigadier general, by the name of Amir Avivi, A-V-I-V-I, Amir Avivi. And they do, like, almost daily, not every day, but almost every day briefings, half an hour or so of where things are standing, where they are. Jonathan, right, Conricus is one you might see on the news too. And he's also another good one to watch. I hope you're all on social media, because that's where these guys post a lot. Better be on Twitter, you better be on Facebook, you better be on Telegram, and Truth Social if you can, because that's where a lot of this stuff gets posted. So in any case, the war crimes. And they're making progress. I'll just say that at the moment they're making progress through the Al-Shifa hospital. They are taking extraordinary care not to harm the civilians, the patients, the doctors, the staff within that hospital, and other hospitals in Gaza City. There's no military in the face of the earth that is as ethical and as moral as the IDF. Not even us, not even Americans. Never mind World War II, Dresden, Nagasaki, Hiroshima. All right, let me go to the part now too, where does all this venomous Jew hatred come from? And it's not just over there with Hamas and PIJ and Hezbollah and all of their other proxies like the Houthis firing rockets out of Yemen. It's you know, the Hashd-Shabi, they call them, these militias inside of Iraq that are attacking our American troops. The last number I saw was up in the 50s, 50-something attacks in the last just month, with very little response from us. I think they hit a couple of warehouses, maybe, where there was some ammunition or something. But so all of these are proxies. They're all on the same page of music. It doesn't matter if they're Shiite. It doesn't matter if they're Sunni. You might know this about the Islamic world. And this comes out of the desert, the Bedouin culture. You've heard the saying, I'm sure, I against my brother and I against our cousins, we and our cousins against the other guy, right? And it's expanding, ever expanding concentric circles out, right? And at the macro top level of all of that, you've got Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb. Dar al-Islam means house of Islam. Those places already suborned to Islamic law, to Sharia. And then Dar al-Harb means house of war, all those other places that yet need to be attacked and conquered. And that's the macro view. It doesn't matter if you're Sunni or Shiite or anything else. At the macro level, it's Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb. So that's what you're looking at when you've got a Sunni Hamas and a Shiite PIJ and a Shiite Iran and a Shiite Hezbollah, and the militias in Iraq are Sunni, or some of them might be Shiite too. It doesn't matter. It's all against those who are not Muslim. And in the books of law, as we said again, jihad is warfare against the non-Muslim. So that is the original place where it comes from. And a little bit of history, which I'm sure your pastor has probably gone through with that book up there, which is called the Tanakh. Christians would call it the Old Testament, but for the Jewish people, it's called the Tanakh. And go back to where this all comes from in terms of the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland in the Levant. And I think we probably go back to Abraham, right, in Genesis. And you know how long ago Abraham is said to have migrated with his family and his flocks and his herds up out of Mesopotamia, out of Ur, on up to the Levant as we know it today? You know how long ago that was? Somewhere between 15 and 1900 years BC. So you're talking 3,500 to maybe more than that even, BC. That's when he moved family and was told, this is your promised land, and you know, this will be for you and your descendants. And of course then comes Isaac and Jacob, the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob. And they have continuously occupied and lived in that land since at least 3,500 years BC. I mean, 3,500 years total ago. There is no other people extant on the face of the earth today that has an indigenous people claim to that land of the Levant. What is the Levant? Levant actually is a word from the French, right? In French, levantar is to rise, or to rise. And what it refers to is the rising of the sun. And the sun rises in the east. And so Levant means the place where the sun rises to the east of Europe, is what that would have been. Compared to Europe, that's the east. And by the way, the Arabic word for Levant is al-Sham. And so in the beginning, when there was ISIS, there's no more ISIS anymore, but in the beginning, it was ISIS, ISIS, the acronym, which is Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham. Well, what's al-Sham? Al-Sham is the exact same thing as the Levant, geographically speaking. It's the south and eastern littoral of the Mediterranean Sea, curve around from Turkey on down Syria and Lebanon today, and all the way across to Egypt, and then inland as far as Mesopotamia, and really all the way to Saudi Arabia. That's the Levant, that's al-Sham. Now today, of course, the Islamic State is simply Islamic State. It's not ISIS anymore. And the reason is that they're not just in Iraq and al-Sham anymore. They're all over the world, including Afghanistan. So you can't call them ISIS anymore. And the other term, Daesh, that's the Arabic. And it's the exact same thing. Dolate Islamiyya fi al-Iraq wa al-Sham, the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham. It's the same thing, right? So these guys, you know, are referring to that part of the Middle East that most often I think we'd probably call it the Levant. But you can call it al-Sham. It's the same thing. Abraham and his descendants are there from 3,500 years ago. Moses leads the Israelite people out of Egypt around 1400 BC, as best we can put it in timing. Around 1400 BC, Moses leads the Exodus out of Egypt to the Promised Land because the sons of Jacob had moved, I think probably for work, to Egypt where they got enslaved. But that's why they were there in the first place. They went there for work because Egypt was a thriving country, society, that could offer work at a time when sometimes there was famine in the Levant. So 1400, you got Moses leading the Israelite people out of Egypt, and they come back to their ancestral homeland in the Levant. And they're up against what? They're up against the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Amalekites and all the ites. They take over. And in the Bible, in the Old Testament, is another set of enemies. You might have heard of them. The Philistines. You know who the Philistines were? So, okay, we have to go back in history again. To the time of the Trojan War. And after the Trojan War, you know, Iliad and the Odyssey and Homer and all that, the fighters start going back to wherever they came from or migrating to other places. And a bunch of them migrated south out of the Aegean, out of the islands up there in the Aegean Sea, the Mediterranean, and they come down to settle that northern littoral of the Mediterranean Sea. And that's where the Philistines come from. They were called the Sea People. They're Indo-European. They're not even Semitic. They're not from the Middle East. They're Indo-European people. And as we know, you know, from the Tanakh, they are the absolute enemies of the Jewish people at the time. You know, the whole story with David and Goliath, right? Goliath was a Philistine, exactly. And they were eventually absorbed, as were the Amalekites and the Jebusites and the Canaanites, absorbed into populations, including the Israelite one, and they don't exist anymore. They passed out of existence centuries ago. They simply don't exist anymore. They've amalgamated. They merged into local populations. Now fast forward to the Romans. The Romans, as we know, in the empire period, captured a whole, the whole swath of the area around the Mediterranean. All around the Mediterranean fell to the Roman legions. And that included the land that they called the province of Judea. It's called Judea because who lived there? The Jewish people lived there. And the Romans conquered that. Well, every now and then the Jewish people would revolt. And they got beaten every time. They did not succeed. And fast forward a little bit again, and you come to the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took place around 132, 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there. It lasted a few years, and it was another serious revolt by the Jewish people against the Romans. And again, they lost. They were beaten by the Romans. But this time the Romans said, we've had it up to here with you people. This is it. We're done. And so in addition to the slaughter, the exile, the genocide, and all of that, the Romans decided to rename the territory of the Jewish people. And what did they decide to name it? Philistia. They reached back into history, they knew their history too, and grabbed the name of the Philistines out of the Old Testament and said, okay, from now on, we're calling this Philistia in Latin. And they tried that way to erase the memory, the presence of the Jewish people from the land. Now, of course, that didn't succeed, but that was the intent. That's where the name comes from. It's got nothing to do with anything in modern day, in the modern day. But then we're going to fast forward once again, and let's see, how much of this should I do? This is a lot of history, but let's just say that, the rise of Islam is the 7th century, and then the Ottoman Empire starts taking control of the whole region around the 1200s or so, and eventually the Ottoman Empire conquers the whole area. And they rule it for centuries, the Ottoman Turks. Well, they collapsed by World War I, and what's left today is the modern-day nation-state of Turkey. That's it. But all the rest of the land was to be administered by the victors of World War I. And who were those? Well, it was the British, and it was the French, primarily for that Middle East. And the French were given the mandate in the northern part for what is today, well, it used to be called Syria. There's no Syria anymore. It's wrecked. And Lebanon. And the British, though, were given a much bigger mandate to administratively deal with, because there was no more administrative supervision or anything for basic services or anything else in these regions after the Turks were beaten. And so the British were given this huge expanse of land in what we would call the Levant. And they were legally authorized by the League of Nations. So the League of Nations, of course, the early 20th century, right? And the League of Nations had the authority to authorize the British to administer this land, the British Mandate. And the British had fought against the Ottoman Empire, and you remember the story of Lawrence of Arabia? Okay, well, what was that story about? That story was about Lawrence and the British teaming up with Arabs on the Arabian Peninsula to fight the Turks. And so the British had kind of a soft spot for the Arabs because they'd been their allies to help overthrow the Ottoman Empire. And it so happened that a clan of these Arabs is called the Hashemites. And because of fighting in the Arabian Peninsula, they got kicked out of Mecca. They'd formerly been in charge of Mecca. Well, the Hashemites got kicked out of Mecca, and the British are now feeling really sorry for them because they helped them defeat the Turks. And the British are thinking, what can we do for these people, these dispossessed people? We know. So they took the British mandate, which the League of Nations said, British, you establish a Jewish homeland there, and they split it in half because they felt sorry for the Hashemites. And they created the brand new, entirely never before country of Jordan. Jordan never existed before the 20th century. The British made it. They created it out of nothing. They also created Iraq. Iraq never existed before either. The British created it. And they put for Jordan, they put Abdullah, Hashemite king, on the throne, and that's the same name as his grandson now, the current king of Jordan, is also named Abdullah. So already half the Jewish homeland that's been designated legally by the League of Nations is now already split off and given to Jordan. But nevertheless, the Jewish people said, you know, we're gonna still establish our homeland, and the British, you know, went forward. But in the early 20th century, the Arabs of the area were really upset that you know, the Jews were going to get a modern-day nation-state of their own. I mean, have you ever heard of the doctrine of sacred space? It says in Islam that any land ever owned or occupied, conquered by Islam is forever waqf. W-A-Q-F means land endowed by Allah, by God, to the Muslim people in perpetuity. And if they ever lose the land, they have to fight and fight and fight forever till they get it back. That's the doctrine of sacred space. Well, not only has the Ottoman Empire lost, and Islam has lost this whole Levant, and it's now being administered by Kufar, by infidels, British, it's going to be given to the Jews, which have been the enemies of Islam since the time of Mohammed. You probably know that in the time of Muhammad, if you ever read his biography, the Sirah wa Sulallah, in English, I mean it's in English, and he, if he ever lived, we're not quite sure. If you read Robert Spencer, there's really no evidence that Muhammad ever lived, but let's pretend he did. And I mean, in the archaeological record or anything else like coins or anything else, no record whatsoever. But nevertheless, at the time he rises to power in the 7th century, there were 3 very large and powerful Jewish tribes on the Arabian Peninsula. They'd been exiled in previous wars and so forth, the Banu Kanuka, the Banu Nadir, and the Banu Qurayza. And subsequently, Muhammad or whomever, they go to war and annihilate every one of them. And you know the chant that you're hearing them say sometimes on the streets now? Khaybar o Khaybar ya Yahud, Jaish Muhammad ya Yahud. Okay, that's Arabic. And what it means is Khaybar o Khaybar. Khaybar is an oasis in northern Saudi Arabia today, kind of along the Red Sea coast in the west. And it was the place where some of these Jews had fled after Muhammad first attacked them. And they fled up to this oasis called Khaybar to get away from the armies of Muhammad. Well, he chased after them. He comes to Khaybar. And they had not converted. He said in the autobiography, if we advance to the town and we hear the call to prayer at dawn, then we will not attack, because that means, you know, they're now Muslim. But if we do not hear the call to prayer at dawn, then we attack because we know that they're Jewish. Well, there was no call to prayer, attacks, slaughters them, and that's where the saying comes from, that they're on the streets, these stupid kids on the university campuses, Khaybar o Khaybar, ya Yahud, hey Jews, Jaish Muhammad, the army of Muhammad, Sayayud, is coming back. That's what that saying means. And I don't know if they know it or not, or what it refers to or not. I don't know if they know that. Maybe they don't. But I'll tell you what, some of them in there do. And the imams know, and the mosques know. But that's what that means. The army of Muhammad is coming back to kill you. That's what they're chanting on the streets. So, okay, where are we? So we're up to the partition. And let's go to World War II. And the League of Nations now gives way to the United Nations, and the United Nations picks up all of the provisions of the League of Nations, including the establishment of a Jewish homeland in their ancestral lands. And so 1948, in May of 1948, it is announced, except what? There's another partition. So the land that the Jews were supposed to get is now chopped again down. And the United Nations offered to the Jewish people this little tiny remnant of land to form a country, and the other part of it to the Arabs to have well, the first two-state solution was Jordan, right? But now they're offering another partition to make another jihadi Arab state, And the Israelis, Ben-Gurion, first prime minister, says, yes, we'll take it, we'll do it, we'll make our nation, we'll create our state, our modern-day nation state. And so they did. But the Arabs, what did the Arabs do? The very day after the announcement of independence, 5 Arab armies attack Israel. You got Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. All at once from all sides. Somehow, Israel survives with a lot of help. I mean, there was help coming in from the outside, including us, and they survive. However, all of Judea and Samaria is now occupied by Jordan, up to and including eastern Jerusalem. Jerusalem is split, and Gaza is taken over by the Egyptians, all the way until 1967. And never once in all that time did either Egypt or Jordan try to establish a two-state solution or establish, another Arab state. Not once. They just ruled over it, that's all. 67 war, Israel again prevails in the Six-Day War, and this time they take back Gaza and the Sinai, and they take back eastern Jerusalem, and for the first time they're praying at the Western Wall in 2,000 years, and they take back Judea and Samaria from Jordan. And again, international law says that if the party that's been attacked wins the war and occupies land of the aggressor, that's legitimate, that's legal. Look at World War I in Germany, look at World War II in Germany. I mean, you can look at many other examples. Land taken in a defensive war by the one that's been attacked is legitimate to keep. Besides which, it's been theirs anyway for 3,500 years. But they are now in Judea, Samaria, and also Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, which they eventually, the Sinai, they gave back to Egypt in a later agreement, but we don't have to go to all of that. And so what I wanted to paint for you there was the legitimacy of not only the Jewish state of Israel, on their ancestral homeland, legally from the League of Nations to the United Nations to all of these wars of aggression that they won. There's no occupation. You can't occupy your own land. Occupation means in a state of war that between two warring parties, the one party occupies the land of the other. That's occupation. This is Israel's own land, internationally recognized legally from the League of Nations in 1920, all the way on, or 22, all the way on up to the current day. All right, let's move now to, bring it home, because we've heard the spokespeople for the Islamic State calling for jihad all over the world, attack the Jews, attack the Americans, attack anybody who's supporting Israel. You've got Al-Azhar. You know what Al-Azhar is? Al-Azhar is the university in Cairo that is the oldest university of Sunni learning in Islam for about 1,000 years. So it is the seat of authority for Sunni learning. On the Shiite side, you'd be looking at Qom in Iran. But on the Sunni side, it's Al-Azhar. And they have issued a recent fatwa. A fatwa is a response to a question of religious doctrine. A question about the Islamic doctrine is answered by a senior with authority, a cleric of Islam, a juridical scholar, and that is a fatwa. Well, in their fatwa, they have also declared jihad against, everybody, the Jews and the Americans. And so all of a sudden, I work with Tom Trento and the United West, and we had a program going for quite a while called Defend the Border. And that was about defending our own border. And we worked with Tom Homan, former ICE director under President Trump, and we just could not get traction. Nobody was listening to us. Nobody would help us. Nobody would support us. And so Defend the Border collapsed. And it's kind of folded into the United West now, and if you go to the unitedwest.com or .org, either way, website, you'll find a tab at the top for Defend the West. And so we're still working that issue. But bringing it back home now, I want to talk about borders. And all of a sudden, you know, that Israel's borders are assaulted, and, you know, hundreds and hundreds of their people are slaughtered in the most atrocious ways, and others taken hostage. All of a sudden, you've got people in senior positions of U.S. agencies and organizations. Oh, gee, you think that could possibly ever happen here in America? I want to mention to you the San Diego Field Office Intelligence Division of the CBP, Customs and Border Protection, which back on October the 20th issued a bulletin. And this is the bulletin. It's unclassified. It's online. And in this bulletin, they kind of actually glommed on. And they said, this is a warning, dated again, October the 20th, that due to war in the Middle East, it says, there might be terror-tied individuals seeking to travel from the Middle East across the U.S. southwestern border into the United States. You think? Anyway, the warning goes on in the bulletin to say to CBP, be on the lookout for military-age males, military gear, lone travelers, or ties to the Middle East. October 2023. And on the bulletin, as you can maybe see, you see these three colored patches or logos in the middle there. Those are the patches of Hamas, Hezbollah, and PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So they don't actually name them. It's kind of curious. They don't name them, but they show their patches, their logos. Like, be on the lookout for these guys, especially if they're waving their logos around. The Customs and Border Protection has a new chief. He took office earlier this year. I think it was around maybe March or April or somewhere in there. His name is Jason Owens, and he's reputed to be a very good guy. And they're happy at CBP that he's been chosen as the CBP chief. Well, he gets on Twitter on October 17, and he says, since October the 1st, that would be 16 days time, he said that over 18,000 illegal aliens had evaded CBP in 16 days, 18,000. I mean, I'm not going to go through all the numbers that I have here, but they're horrific. And those would be what you call the gotaways. That's the term they use for people they may have seen or in a distance, but they couldn't catch them, or maybe they're on the surveillance cameras, but they couldn't catch them. That's how they count up to 18,000. That's just 16 days, the first half of October, over 18,000. You know, who do you think those are? Who do we think those are? So again, I'll skip all the numbers, but they're really awful. Again, the month of October set all-time records for border crossings. So do you all know perhaps who Todd Bensman is? Todd Bensman is a really good investigative reporter. He also teaches at a university down in Texas, where I lectured for his class actually this past March. Anyway, you can find him also as a fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies, CIS.org. CIS.org. This is Todd Bensman. He writes there. He's on Twitter. You got to get on Twitter. And he posts videos and writing. Well, Todd was focusing recently on the category of illegals that are called special interest aliens, SIAs, special interest aliens. The reason they're called that is because they come from, I don't know what you call them, maybe troubled countries, terror-sponsoring countries. And there's a list of them officially. There's a list. And so he was highlighting, you know, how many of these special interest aliens are getting in. Now, you might know that as far south as at least Central America, the southernmost country in South America is Panama, and between Panama and the northern part of South America is this very rugged, jungle, mountainous, raging river place called the Darien Gap. And then you're in South America, and the topmost country there is Colombia, right? And so a lot of these illegals are coming up. They can fly into other places like Ecuador, for example, also Cuba, and they don't need visas to get into those countries. They can land there, and then they get on the path or the road or maybe a bus north, al norte, and they come on up, and they have to get through the Darien Gap, and a lot of people die in there. It's very rugged, very difficult traveling through there. But he's talking about these SIAs who went through there. But even as far south as that, say the Darien Gap in Panama, do you know who Michael Yon is? Y-O-N? Some of you may. He's also another very good investigative reporter on Twitter, Michael Yon, Y-O-N. And I've gotten to know him a bit. And we were on the phone one night back in June. And he's sitting in a cafe on the Panama side of the Darien Gap. And he's saying, I'm looking at all these buses, big white buses, and they're loading up and they're headed north. And the people getting on them, they're all Chinese, and they're men. They're young, fighting age, military-looking, bearing Chinese men. And the villagers in the town were telling him that after these guys had made it through the Darien Gap, and you get through and you, oh, shoot, made it, I got there, I'm in Panama. They're relieved. And he said the villagers were telling him that as they were, relaxing and feeling relieved, they were doing something kind of weird. They were killing chickens. You ever hear this? They're killing chickens and drinking shots of their blood. Yeah, I know, that's gross. And Michael and I didn't know what that was, but we both know Li Mengyan, who is the Chinese virologist whistleblower who escaped out of China a few years ago, got to know her. She's taught me everything I know about epidemiology and virology, which I knew nothing about before. But we thought to ask her. And so Michael did ask her, what's this drinking of the shots of blood thing in kind of like relief or celebration? They made it through the Darien Gap. And she says, oh, that's the signature training ritual of the Jungle Tigers. Jungle Tigers is the nickname given to the 75th Special Operations Battalion of the People's Liberation Army of China, formed by Xi Jinping back in 2013, she said. And they're all coming up. Now, what I was going to say before is that down as far as Panama, and I don't know, maybe even further south, but certainly by Central America, everybody coming through is given free one of these. That's our taxpayer money. It comes either out of the NGO, the U.S. NGOs, non-governmental organizations like Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, the Methodists, whoever they are, etc., who are funded themselves by the Department of State, and that's our taxpayer dollars. Well, they hand out the clothing and the shoes and the food and the water and the backpacks, and oh yeah, they get debit cards too. Do you guys get debit cards every month? And they get reloaded by the United Nations every month. I mean, I'd like to get some of that. They're all handed these debit cards, and they're reloaded like $300-400 or something every single month. And so they've got all that, and then they get the cell phones. Now what's happening, Todd Bensman is reporting this, they are told now by the Biden administration, CBP, DHS, that they should go on the phone to an app that's called the CBP-1, O-N-E, CBP-1 app. And at that app on the phone, they're supposed to make an appointment with an asylum hearing judge in the United States for a hearing. And oh, by the way, the backup is now 7 to 10 years. And so a lot of illegals that formerly were categorized as illegals trying to sneak across in between ports of entry are now flooding through the ports of entry because all of a sudden, it's like fairy dust and they're all legal. And all they have to do is show their phone app, I got my appointment, and they get waved right through, and they're given a piece of paper that is called a notice to appear, and on that is the date, that they're supposed to show up and have their asylum hearing. I mean, how many of them are going to show up in 10 years, right? So the CBP agents, many of them have been pulled off the line. I was down at Eagle Pass in Texas in August of this year, and we were talking to CBP. This is what they told us, that the agents are pulled off the line, huge stretches of border, let's say Texas, Arizona too, in order to staff the ports of entry now, because the ports of entry are getting flooded with all these illegals with their cell phone apps. And they have to process each one of them, and even if it's a brief processing, you know, no vetting, no background check, none of that, even if each one is brief, and oh, by the way, they're not doing DNA testing of children and alleged family members anymore. So you might have heard Senator Ted Cruz speaking on news a couple of nights ago, maybe it was over the weekend, that the family units, well, alleged family units are coming up, and he saw this with his own eyes, coming up to the ports of entry, and you know, these old men, like, well, I shouldn't say old men, okay. They were maybe older, quite a bit older than these kids they had with them. And they're claiming that the kids are their kids. But Biden stopped all DNA testing that Trump used to enforce on May 31st of this year. No more. No more DNA, you know, swab, cheek swab. And they would do it on the spot. Are you related, you little kid, to this other person who claims you as a relative? They're not doing that anymore. United States government is the biggest child trafficker right now on the face of the earth. So they're pulled off the line. The agents are pulled off the line to process these people and, you know, their paperwork at the ports of entry. And what that does is leaves all these wide open spaces in between the ports of entry uncovered by CBP. And it's not because they don't want to. They really, I mean, they signed up to do this work because they wanted to defend our border, defend America. The suicide rate is skyrocketing in CBP. They are so discouraged, they're so in despair because they're not allowed to do their job. But so all these spaces are left open. So where do you think the jungle tigers go? Where do you think the jihadis go? The human traffickers, the narco traffickers, the child traffickers. They're not going to come through the ports of entry. Why? The spaces are wide open now. All they have to do is waltz through and, you know, it's home free. And they come here and all the benefits are given. They get housing, they get health care, they get education for the kids. I mean, what's not to like? And the debit cards continue to get reloaded every month. This is what's going on. So the point of all of this being, and this is where I'll end this, is they're already here. They are pouring into this country. All of the above with malintent that I just mentioned have been pouring into this country for a long time, and especially now that these big stretches of border are wide open. And there's no way on earth, I mean, beginning with the DOD special airlift out of Kabul back in August of 2021, there's no way on earth our enemies aren't taking advantage of this opportunity. I mean, they'd have had to been brain dead to not take advantage of it. So they're here. They're already here. Add to that, think about China. You know, I started this talking about the summit today out in San Francisco with, you know, our crack team up against Xi Jinping and his folks. And, you know, they not only have all these jungle tigers coming in, which we know now about, but they've also got, you've probably read the stories about the secret police stations, which are not diplomatic facilities, and also these other facilities that are called special, what are they, special operations, I think, facilities, something like that. And they're all over the United States. And that's in addition to embassy in Washington, D.C., United Nations mission in New York, and an additional 4 or 5 consulates. There's a consulate in New York, a consulate in Chicago, one in San Francisco. Why do you think they went to San Francisco? I mean, it's a really welcoming kind of a place for Chinese Communist Party, and the last one would be Los Angeles. So they're all over here. And by the way, the Chinese, we know now, have just it's been announced or reported, establishing additional connections with Cuba. And they not only took over the old Soviet-era listening post, intelligence gathering post at Lourdes, but they are now announcing that they're going to form a joint military training program with the Cubans. What could go wrong? So they're everywhere, and my sort of hypothesis about this is that the Cuba post, whatever that presence is and is going to be, is probably the command and control center for all of this other stuff that's already here. I mean, that's my idea. I can't say that I can validate that, but that's my idea. Let me finish with this, I've talked about this part of tonight's talk being, that our senior officials are finally maybe kind of sort of waking up. Let me mention, President Donald Trump on Truth Social, and he was posting last October the 23rd, and here's what he wrote. Quote, "The fight in Gaza is coming home to the USA. The tens of thousands of strong young men from the Middle East that have already invaded our country and are continuing to come totally unchecked will become a problem the likes of which we have never seen before. Close our border now, stop the onslaught, stop the invasion." End of Trump's quote, his post on Truth Social. So let me stop there. There's so much more we could talk about, but